Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this Lean Pub Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing William S. Vincent. Based in Boston, Will has had a diverse career, starting out as a book editor at the publisher Houghton Mifflin, getting an MBA, working for startups, becoming a software developer, and teaching computer science. Eventually, he successfully moved into a career doing the roles that he's filling now of teaching, writing, and self-publishing, which he's been doing for the last 2 or more years. You can follow him on Twitter at WSV3000 and check out his website at WSVincent.com. Sign up for his newsletter at WSVincent.com/newsletter. And you can listen to his interviews on the popular Django Chat podcast, which he co-hosts with his colleague Carlton Gibson. Will is the author of 3 Lean Pub books: Django for Beginners, Build Websites with Python and Django; Django for APIs, Build Web APIs with Python and Django; and his latest book, Django for Professionals, Production Websites with Python and Django. In this interview, we're going to talk about Will's background and career, professional interests, his books, and at the end, we'll talk about his experience as an author. So thank you, Will, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. You've got an interesting one for the typical guest, in comparison to the typical guest on this podcast. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in books and publishing.
Sure. Yeah, I loved your intro. So I'm still working on the short version of my background. But basically, I grew up very non-technical. I grew up in Vermont, surrounded by books, no computers. Computers, this was the 90s, were always broken and buggy, and I had to kind of fix it for my family, but I always hated doing it. So I never thought I'd be involved with computers, and started my career, as you mentioned, as a book editor, and am now publishing books on programming. So I've gone kind of full circle, but I really came to it later in life. I came to it basically, I was working in publishing. I was a book editor. Dream job, going extremely well. And then I saw Amazon coming in. So this is 2006, 7, 8. And I saw them just completely dominating the publishers. I saw the publishers sticking their head in the sand. And I saw the colleagues that I aspired to be getting fired with no good job prospects. So I thought, well, I'm 26. I'm going to figure something out here. So I learned.
Yeah, just to pause you there, because this is such an interesting moment. I don't really want to sort of get over it too quickly. So you,
Sure.
So you studied history in university, if I'm correct.
Yeah, history. History is the major. Yeah, history, econ, lots of stuff.
Yeah, and you decided to go into the book publishing industry to be an editor, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. I mean, so editing is, most people don't understand what editing is. I mean, I have an MBA, so I have years of experience explaining it. I mean, it's really not staring at a paper editing. I mean, that's a tiny, tiny part of it. It's, this is an abused term now, but really it's a product manager, except I would say more, because a modern book editor is doing acquisitions. So you're dealing with agents, you're negotiating lots of stuff on that. You're doing the editing, but you're also really in charge internally of the whole publishing pipeline. So you go through you acquire the book, you go through all the edits, and then you hand it off to copy editing. Then there's marketing, publicity, jackets, all the rest. It's published. Then a year later, you come through for paperback. And you're doing this for, depends on the publishing house, but 2 or 3 seasons a year. So it worked out for me. I was doing about 15 books a year. But at any one time, I was working on 45 different books.
And when you say acquire a book, how did that process work in your experience?
Oh, yeah. So this is a traditional trade model. So I'd also worked in academic publishing in college and before, where there's really no advances. But trade publishing is kind of the books you would buy in a bookstore. So I was nonfiction, fiction, Best American Series. But the way it works in the modern world is you have agents. Because there's so much volume. So as an editor, you have relationships with agents, and there's a small number of major agencies that will do a book proposal. So a book proposal would come in, and usually it's 20 to 40 pages, and it basically lays out the background of the book. So fiction, it has a writing sample, sort of gives hints of the plot. There you're evaluating on how good is the writer. Do they have a platform? Platform's not really that important. Nonfiction is all about platform. So platform would be, it's a book on psychology, and it's a professor at Dartmouth College, and it's much more about who they are and what the topic is, and then it's just assumed it's less about the writing quality. But anyways, you get proposals all the time from agents, and you're reading those. We have assistant who reads those for you. So I started off as an assistant and worked my way up. And then if you like a book, the agent, ideally, from the agent's point of view, will have a book auction. So if they have 3 editors involved, they'll have it's like a blind bid auction. And basically, they want to get as much money as possible. And There's a couple levers around, advance and other things you can negotiate, but it's very commerce heavy, I guess is the point. It's the amount of time you spend actually editing. Like the only editing time I spent was like nights and weekends. In the office, it was nonstop product management and trying to acquire books.
And it's really, thank you for that great explanation. It's one of those things that, like, for a lot of people, they only know it from the other side.
Yeah, yeah.
And they only know they will ever only know it from the other side, which is from the side of the aspiring author. And from their perspective, it's funny, you bring it sort of modestly, like what it's like explaining what a book editor does to a sort of stereotypical MBA. But to aspiring authors, a book editor is the gatekeeper.
Yes, but it's not the gatekeeper. It's the agent.
I suppose.
It's actually the agent. No, 100%. The best editors become agents for their authors. Like John Grisham's editor became his agent. And here I'll tell you why. Because agents get a percentage. Agents get 15% usually of earnings from an author, whereas the editor is very poorly paid. So, you're crazy to kind of stay an editor unless you really like doing it or you don't want to be an agent. So, and it gets more and more pre-processed. So a lot of times, John Grisham's agent, I doubt that publishing house does much editing to the book. That's done. They kind of do it before and present it as is because of who he is as an author. But the thing is, editors can't look at, just from a volume perspective, can't look at unsolicited manuscripts, and actually often won't, because if someone sends in, this is like movie studios and scripts, they won't look at something that's unsolicited, because if you send in an idea and then they do a movie, you can sue them and say, oh, I pitched you that idea and I have proof that your mail office opened that thing, and so you were inspired by it, and so you have to pay me.
Right.
So in books, there's not enough money, so people don't really get libelous about it, but that's the same reason. So the number one advice for a trade book author is get an agent. Now, technical books, which we can talk about, you don't have agents involved, but if you want the Great American Novel or a big pop nonfiction Malcolm Gladwell thing, if you get the right agent, you will get a book contract.
Okay, I see. But so I guess I just used the wrong terminology. But so that so first you need an agent. That person is the gatekeeper for your entry into the book publishing world. But then there needs to be someone at a book company who participates at a publishing company that participates in an auction that is initiated by the agent, and then someone and then those, ideally from the agents and the author's perspective, there's all these book acquirers competing to offer the highest price for the.
Yeah, and that's the value that an agent brings, is that they understand the marketplace, they understand the editors, they sort of drive up the prices, but they also save everyone time. So they know when they get a proposal in, they know they're thinking, Will at Houghton would be good for this. They're sort of calculating. So if they invest the time, because they're not getting paid up front for their work, so they only get paid if they sell something. So they're heavily invested in the success of their authors. And there's as in anything, there is a very strong hierarchy of agents. So if I could list a couple. If they selected your work, you're gonna do well.
I see.
It may not be a best-selling book, but you'll get a good advance, and it will definitely be acquired.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you bring up this concept of hierarchy, because the book publishing industry, the trade book publishing industry, has its own unique culture. You mentioned there's distinctions between nonfiction and fiction in various ways, and the world of fiction, and especially like high literature, has its own culture. And I bring that up because I wanted to then now get to where I interrupted you, which is, there you are in the mid-2000s, around the time Kindle is coming out, and you see these publishers with their heads in the sand, a situation which many people feel persists to this day.
It does.
I remember being at a conference, at the Book Expo America conference in New York. I think this was 2013, so it's a while ago now. And I think it was, I might get the companies wrong, but there was this panel, and I think it was the CEO of Simon & Schuster had the CEO of Overdrive waving an iPad kind of aggressively in her direction, saying, "This isn't a science experiment. This is real." And this CEO of Simon & Schuster is on lists of like the top 50 most influential women in America. And here you have someone sort of he wasn't trying to be rude. He was just he couldn't believe that, the top people at the top of the publishing industry were and I'm not making any particular claims about the CEO of Simon & Schuster myself, but this guy was clearly exasperated at his situation, that this technology, even in 2013, was being not kind of ignored.
Well, so I have a perspective on this. Further, there's been rapid consolidation in the industry. So Houghton was had been bought and sold once before by the private equity groups, which is a whole separate thing I get into, and then was merging with Harcourt while I was there. So basically, because the industry was sort of on a downward trend, which continues today, they were just firing people and cutting out marketing and publicity and sales, and basically making it less fun, because people always knew that you weren't going to be rich in publishing, but they enjoyed doing it. They enjoyed the work. And then basically these conglomerates came in and, in my opinion, killed that. So when I went to business school, a lot of it was I was saying, yeah, exactly that. Why don't they see reality? And I have more empathy, I guess, for their perspective, which is that just as in any field that's being disrupted by technology, someone who's at the top of a publishing house, so they spent their entire career in publishing, traditional publishing, right? 20, 30 years. They're only there for 2 to 4 or 5 years max. So even if they are totally convinced, and even if they think they can start implementing the changes, all they're going to end up doing is firing a ton of people and pissing off all their colleagues. And then the next person's going to get the credit for it. Like, there's no incentive to make that huge break, because they see that it's coming, but all their money is made on the traditional way. The whole staffing model. So Kindle was paying to digitize the books because the publishers, including Houghton, didn't want to do it, because they're like, well, why would we spend money on this? They make the economic side of it too. You make way less on a ebook. Plus, publishers are paranoid about piracy, which, as a technical book author, I think is hilarious, because your average, fiction reader isn't able to pirate books. But yeah, they're just in a tough situation. I mean, I'm still frustrated by them, and I think the industry has to change. But I mean, my colleagues today who have stayed in the industry, what's happened is, because you can self-publish, with LeanPub or just on Amazon, Amazon, you can take a Word doc and publish it. So the role of agents, the role of editors, now they just look at the self-published list and they, do book contracts based on that. The problem is that the value of a traditional book publisher has greatly diminished, in my opinion, from what it used to be. As an editor, you're not afforded the time to spend with authors that you used to have. So I was working on 15 books a year. That's 45 books at a time. That's a lot of books. I couldn't spend anywhere near as much time on them as I wanted. So they had to come in fairly polished, basically. The other issue is the marketing publicity budgets were just slashed, because that's an easy thing to gut. Plus, publicity, what did they used to do? They used to call up their friend at the New York Times or whatever paper and get reviews. Well, all those people have lost their jobs. So there's really nothing for those folks to do, right? So the whole industry is feeling its contraction. You have the book layout people. They love doing beautiful book layouts for print. They don't want to spend any time on the ebook one. Plus, ebook is hard to do because you had Kindle, Kobo, and all these different ones. So it's just the whole system was designed for the traditional way. And, if you're in charge of these organizations, nobody in your organization is, except maybe your investors, is excited about the transition towards electronic. Plus, the costs are lower. When I was there too, you had the issue of Apple and Amazon, where with the pricing wars and, so everyone sees the threat, but no one can have the solution. And I don't think the solution is going to come internally.
And just to continue with the pile on for the unfortunate book publishing industry,
I have empathy for them. Yeah.
No, I know. And I was listening to a podcast preparing for this, another interview you did, and you mentioned that even the importance of the publisher's brand.
Nobody cares.
Decreasing.
Yeah. I think it was always pretty small, but it's like a movie, right? Before every movie, there's a long list of producers and movie studios. That's purely back scratching for the industry. I mean, at the end of the day, nobody cares if it's Houghton or Knopf or self-published book. If there are any people who care, they're not really who you want to deal with anyways. And that's just because, so these days, if you're a publisher, and I know this firsthand because I've helped some people get published, if you go to a traditional publisher, they will say, well, you have to bring your marketing with you. They'll say part of the proposal is saying, well, I've got 20,000 people on my newsletter. Authors will hire out of their own pocket publicists. So not to mention the cycle is very long and slow. I mean, we had issues where I had an author who was very prolific, a fiction writer, Rick Bass, and we had to push him back and hold him back because it didn't fit the sales cycle of Houghton to have a new book from him every year. We needed some space, which is crazy because he just wanted to put it out. But that's just the system that you're dealing with. So at the end of the day, and I think I'd say the number one thing though that traditional publishers are doing wrong is they've completely gutted the mid-list. So it used to be the case that every season, so Houghton, Simon Schuster, pick your place, they have one or two books that they've paid millions of dollars for that's sort of like their lead book. So I remember like Hillary Clinton's biography is one of them. A book like that everyone's heard of, Barack Obama. You use that as everyone in the company is excited around that, and you use that in the negotiations with Barnes & Noble, which doesn't really exist anymore, as sort of the lead. And then you slowly get down the list of, if it's 40 books you're putting out that term. So everyone's anchored around that big book, but you never make money on those books because you pay a huge advance. You pay a 7-figure advance. So that's just sort of a cost of doing business, and it makes everyone internally feel good. And at the end of the day, it's not the editors. Editors are not judged on like the return, the ROI. I mean, that's the sort of the messed up thing about the industry. If you have a business mind, which I do, is that as an editor, you are incentivized to pay more because nobody judges you on the return of investment on your book. All that you can say is, oh, I'm the editor on Hillary Clinton's book. Well, how are you the editor? Because I paid the most. Well, how'd you pay the most? Because I convinced my publisher. So then agents say, oh, Will's a $2 million guy now. He has up to a $2 million budget, right? And then usually I would leave every 2 or 3 years and bounce publishing houses. So by the time the book even comes out, I'm long gone. I guarantee you no one is doing any accounting of all the costs of it. So anyway, so that dynamic is messed up, but it's the mid-list where all the money is made. So the mid-list, and that's mainly where I was focused as a younger editor at the time. That's when you take a chance on someone. That's when you pay $50,000, $100,000, and then it sells like $1 million book. That's where they make all their money, that and the backlist. But they've gutted out the mid-list because it's expensive and it's error prone. And all the people there still want to work on those big books. They want to buy the important books like Philip Roth. We published him at Houghton. We paid a lot for his books, more than almost all of them sold. So you're left with the big books that you lose money on. You gut out the mid-list, you gut out marketing publicity, and it makes for a challenging environment. Still with fantastic people working in there, but at least for me, I said, well, I have options at this point. I'm still young, so I'm going to go see what else is out there.
Yeah, thanks for that wonderful explanation.
Don't get me going.
Yeah, no, it's great. One of the curious things, I mean, people can be romantic about anything, but there is a peculiar kind of romance around book publishing because publishing a book can be seen by people as elevating their social standing in a way that's kind of unique to book publishing, I think.
Yeah, well, that's what. So I always ask people if they ask me for advice on book publishing, if they should self-publish or traditional publish. What's your goal? So most people, especially, and I'd be curious your experience interviewing authors. Most people's goal is to publish a book. It is not to make money, and furthermore, they need the hand-holding. And most people, despite all the things I've just said, will hear me say that, and they will still want to go with whatever press makes a big impression in their mind. If it's a technical press, if it's a fiction press, so you can't really beat that out of people, and that's fine. That's it's easier to not self-publish. There's a lot of stuff you got to do, even with a great technology like LeanPub. There's a lot of steps you got to do, and if you need an editor to ride you to get things done, and there's some advantage there. It's almost impossible you'll make any real money off it. But that's fine, right? It's about an ego stroke or it's a marketing expense for a consultant. Like these are the traditional reasons. But for me, when I started publishing books, I was doing it thinking, well, this will be my business. And I also knew how the sausage was made. And there's no advances in technical book publishing, basically. So that's why I sort of opted in. And, now I'm in a position where, with the sales of my books, all the regular publishers approach me all the time saying, well, why don't you come publish with us? And it's like, well, I would love to. I always want to hear. I'm like, why do you think I would want to do that? Like, why would I go from 90 something % to 30% for an already published book where I've done all the work, I've done all the updates, I've done all the marketing, there's no value there. But I think there is value if you're just, a professional programmer and you need the hand holding and you just want to get a book out. But for someone who's already kind of along the way, the value proposition isn't there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that perspective. I mean, I actually have interviewed a couple of people who did have the romance beaten out of them. I remember one guy in particular. So he was a technical book author, and he submitted to one of the big name technical book publishers. And he got the email, and he's like, I just went skipping out of the house, and I was on cloud nine. And he's like, fast forward a year, and it was a nightmare. And what particularly frustrated him was the fact that the book was done, and they're like, it's going to be 6 months until it comes out because we've got to, do our formatting and copy editing and stuff like that.
And they print it overseas, so they can't print on demand. Yeah,
and he found that just incredibly heartbreaking because he was seeing the technology get older and older as his book was not coming out, but the words were done and the code samples were done, everything was done. And then he saw that there's like behind the romance of the big name and seeing your name on the shelf, which is an amazing thing, is this real actual business that isn't romantic and doesn't necessarily always work very well. And no matter how well meaning or well intentioned people are, it can end up putting you in a bad place. But as you say, like, if you are just starting out, then getting a book published by publisher that can help get you some respect that you might not have otherwise got is worth all the money in the world in a way in the long run. And it's not necessarily for the particular royalties that you're going to get on a book that you primarily get value out of it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think even, so one of the best technical book publishers is No Starch Press, who I know some of the folks there. They have their contracts online. They're public. So you can go and look at those. But yeah, you should never write a book for money. Even though I did that, you should never assume that that's going to make money. And I think, but I think also just the form, this is probably an existential thing for LeanPub. And actually you guys are probably seeing this because, you have video courses. There's some issues with, I often wonder, is book format appropriate for, certainly for framework books. So I've written 3 books on Django Web Framework. Every 9 months, a new version comes out. So, it's bad enough for programming languages, which there's updates, but it's not a major thing where it's every couple of years. But every 9 months, I mean, you simply couldn't publish that with a traditional publisher. So and if you notice, actually, there's almost no Django books out there, even though Django is partly because it updates all the time. People get burned out and, they just don't want to do the work. But the other thing is that there is this price ceiling on books where people don't want to pay more than $40 for a book. They'll pay, $60, $80 for a video. And if you look at the amount of content I won't name names, but, a 2-3 hour video, that's 40, 50 pages worth of stuff. Like my new book is almost 400 pages. Right. So, it's sort of my fault for putting too much out there. But the value proposition is way off with books, just as a genre. So I don't know. I mean, I love physical books. I often ask people, because I sell digital books, I sell Kindle, and I sell paperback. And I ask people, which do you prefer? And I don't really see a strong split based on age or, there's a lot of people who like a physical book, but there's a lot of people who, like updates too. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, this is normally, we certainly save this part of the conversation for near the end, but the view from 30,000 feet here is that educating people is very important, and that more and more people are learning how to write software or how to program. Programming is becoming a more important part of our daily lives, and how programming is taught, how people learn about frameworks like Django is actually a really important part of that drives our economy and our daily lives. And the whole industry is trying to figure out what to do. I mean, programming and software have been around for decades and decades, but there's something about our current moment where things are changing. And there was a response. One sort of response to this was MOOCs.
Yep.
For example, massively open online courses, which are largely video-based. And one of the things that Will's bringing up is that, and we've actually encountered this with people with Udemy courses, for example, that are heavily video-based. They're like, wait a minute, it takes me 100 hours to shoot the course, and then it's going to change every year.
Yeah.
So particularly there are certain subjects like the history of Rome where you're probably not going to have to reshoot that course more than once every 5 years or so. And even then you're being kind of precious about being up to date with the latest scholarship. But there are other things where the video format like Khan Academy and things like that is actually seems like at first glance and for many people is very useful in their first touch with it. When you're on the creation side, you realize how quickly things go out of, they're no longer current.
Yeah, the production cost is way higher than text.
Yeah, and so one solution to this is the ebook and platforms like LeanPub, where you make it really dead easy to update, things and to issue those updates not only to all your existing readers, people who've already bought your book, but then once your book is updated, all future readers have a fully updated book. So the book remains, as long as you're doing the work to update the words in the code, it remains current. And it's probably the case that the ebook format is if you're monetizing it, right? Otherwise, you can just have a blog, or something like that. But if you want to monetize it as a sort of defined product, then an ebook, as long as it's got this in progress or easily updatable publishing side of it, then that's actually probably a really good solution. But our courses are actually so LeanPub has a courses thing, and we spent a long time with some very sophisticated people developing this. And it's interesting that when we say we've got courses, people often automatically think videos, but in our head, although you can't put videos in them, you put them up on YouTube and then you can have them in your LeanPub course. I mean, I was kind of naively surprised when people reacted that way, because to me, I was always thinking text, and because from our perspective, one of our hypotheses is that every technical book should actually have let's narrow it down. Every programming book should have an accompanying course that you can take, because if you've already written the book, if you're the author of it, then turning it into a course is basically now let's create some exercises and assign some grades to the quizzes. And if you're a reader, you get to prove to yourself, but then with the certificate that you get at the end, you actually get to prove to other people. So in the current state of affairs, you read a programming book and then you tell people you did so. But if you've got an accompanying course where someone can get certificate, then they've got this kind of social and professional proof that they've actually done it. So it actually increases the value of reading and going through the book to the reader to have an accompanying course that you can take. So this is our theory.
So I think your hypothesis is correct, but I think it's an interesting time because nobody's quite figured out what people want. And partly it's thinking about what are the customer buckets. To me, there's a very small number of people who can make money from out-of-pocket purchases by individuals who don't care about, they don't care about accreditation. So they just want to learn it and sort of prove it. Most of the money is some sort of accreditation thing, or it's a company account. So this is the rise of, lynda.com, which is now LinkedIn, Pluralsight, and O'Reilly would be the three large ones, where a lot of companies will just have a subscription. And I've been next to people, they're like, oh yeah, I can learn Django. I've got a subscription and there's, 30 courses on Django, all from 30 different individual contributors. And there's, I would say no kind of quality control, but these people at these companies, it's easy to buy, right? They want a one-stop shop because the person who's in charge of professional development is HR. Even in a tech company, it is not developers. So while I would like, the GitHub model where they just give developers, I think it's $100 a month and let them buy what they want with it, that would be great. Quality would win out. That's not how it works. Companies want to have control and they want this accreditation. So I don't know. I think you guys are on the right track. I mean, I find it almost, the disconnect between the value that's being added by technical book authors and what they're receiving. I mean, I can see email addresses of people I interact with and buy my books. It's undergrads at pick all the top engineering schools in the U.S. and globally. It's professors at these schools. It's career people who have been doing Python. In my case, been doing Python for 10 years, but never done web development, and they're learning Django. So, the value is immense, but it does come down to kind of why is someone doing it? And I think this is the problem MOOCs had is MOOCs, they came out with MOOCs and it was all these super educated people who are learning for fun, engineers. And guess what? That's not most people, right? Most people aren't taking artificial intelligence for fun at a graduate level. They need to learn Excel and get a check mark so they can get a promotion at work. And that's what most MOOCs are finding. And that's why they're sort of transitioning away from that. Same thing with books. Most people, as a developer, we assume everyone thinks the way we do. And most people are not lifelong learners. They're not really into this. They're just kind of doing what they need to do. And anyways, accreditation is easier to get when it proves something and when someone else pays for it and when you have to do it. I'm biased because the people I deal with are kind of the best students in the world because they've already, chosen my stuff and paid for it. So even when I teach in a classroom setting, it all comes down to who's the client.
Speaking of lifelong learners, I'm going to use that as a very cheesy segue opportunity to get back to your career. So
sure.
You are there in the publishing industry and you realize that it's not going in the direction you think it should, and you decide to get an MBA. And then you, I believe, moved to San Francisco and started working for a company there. Is that correct in the timeline?
Yeah, that's right. So I wanted to move other side of the country and, move from a very traditional industry to a startup. And while I was in business school, as I was leaving publishing, I noticed that we were spending thousands of dollars. Our marketing budget was just for someone to build a website for these authors' books. And I thought, well, I could learn that. So I actually learned that and had a side business throughout business school building websites for authors. So when I then applied to jobs, I wasn't a programmer, but I had some technical ability and I ended up joining. I was fortunate enough to have a couple offers, and I chose by far the riskiest one. It was a small education startup in a room. One of the founders was still in college, and that was called Quizlet, which is now the largest education site in the U.S. So that was a whole separate story. But I was there for 3 years, and at the end of that was like, okay, now what do I do? And decided the one gaping hole in my background was being truly technical. I could sort of build stuff, but I couldn't really build it. And all my MBA colleagues were this is go-go time, so raising money and hiring developers. And I worked a lot on hiring out the initial team at Quizlet, and I didn't really want to spend 2 more years hiring out people because most startups fail. So I thought, well, I'll learn how to code for real. And then even if my startup fails, I've got, another feather in my cap in terms of knowledge. And so I did that, and a couple ups and downs with startups. One failed, another didn't do as well, another was acquired, and it was the last one that was acquired. After that was acquired was when I started writing the books.
And
because
were these all in the education space? Sorry.
One of them was. So the first one I did was a school rating site. This is the one I went off and did on my own initially. So competing with great schools, because if you're moving, as I was, you want to know what's the deal with local schools. All the data is publicly available. I could go on and on about that. So I built, I would say, a better product than great schools, but people don't really want ratings. They just think that they do. And the companies like Zillow and Trulia at the time were in a marketing war. So the affiliate fees that they were paying were quite high, but then they decided to stop fighting. They merged. And Great Schools is a nonprofit that does an okay job. And that's sort of enough for people. So then two startups after that. I taught at Williams College, and then had a little bit of space after this acquisition. And, I had found learning how to program, because I came to it later in life, and I'm certainly not a genius, but I have a brain, and I found it the most frustrating thing I'd ever done in my life. And I largely came to the conclusion it was because the resources for learning it were terrible. They just made no sense. And most programmers learned at such a young age that they just totally forgot and had zero perspective on what it was like to be a learner. So, because when you're 10 or 13 or 14, everything just seems normal and you just forget what you've learned. But I came to it as an adult, and I had, it seared into me the pain points of learning. And I basically had all these notes that I'd written for myself just to not forget things with different frameworks. Django was one of several frameworks I worked with professionally. And I just happened to like Django the best. And so the first book I wrote, Django for Beginners, I put it up on a website. It was my own notes. And then that started getting really good traffic. And at some point I thought, yeah, I'll make it a book. I mean, nobody can stop me.
It's really interesting. One of the things I heard you say, and I might get it slightly wrong in an interview that I was listening to before this podcast, was that endemic to programming culture is often a lot of posturing about how smart you are.
Yeah.
and even worse than posturing, like sometimes people fully convinced. Now I've got to say personally, like I'm a former investment banker, so I'm familiar with the phenomenon. But one particular manifestation of it is people don't want to ask for help, and people sometimes, and because then that means you're not smart. And people will take the opportunity to represent you as not being smart. And it can often be an environment in which questions are answered aggressively, and where people will not go into detail because, again, that's not something that a really smart guy would do. And now, but on the flip side, in programming, because people are often have an engineering mindset, they do kind of like helping. So there's this weird.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think I'm trying to remember where I said that comment. I mean, so I often think, because I came from a sports background and business, and so I love the engineering mindset of helping and sort of not caring about anything other than working on the work. But there is, and this might be specific to the startup scene in San Francisco in 2010 onwards when I was there, where you had a lot of people who were special because they knew how to program. And you have companies like Google where it's just completely tiered. Well, it used to be 2 tiers. Now it's 3 tiers with contract people. But if you were a programmer coming out of college, you made 100,000. And if you came in as an ad rep, you made 50. And it just went from there. And so, if you're young and impressionable, you feel like you have a superpower. This was before boot camps came around. So, you really only could learn programming if you I'm going to generalize here, but if you basically had spent your teenage years with a computer and not, playing sports, not doing these normal things, because you kind of had to have spent that time to learn all these things. And so you just learned by osmosis and chat rooms. And so you didn't feel the pain of there was no learning structure. You just sort of absorbed it and you felt different and probably a little bit ostracized. And then you come to San Francisco and you're like special. I was hiring developers right out of MIT and Stanford for more than I made as a, Ivy League MBA, right? I mean, that's partly why I was like, I was like, wait, I've got a brain. Like, I could learn how to program. And I think it hasn't gotten better. I mean, it's great that programmers are underpaid. So for the value they provide, even at Google, if you're getting paid, mid 6 figures, you're getting underpaid for the value you're providing to the company. But just because you have did a boot camp and now you make 6 figures, experience does matter. But, in the programming field, experience is often not valued, which is, I'm 38 now. So, it's not like medicine where you get older, or finance, right? People sort of tend to, maybe not investment banking. I think in investment banking, they like experience, but in tech, experience is sort of a dirty word, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's I never made it to the sort of upper echelons, but at the top, it's all networks. And
everything is sales.
That's what you build up over time is influence and people you can call upon and things like that.
Right. Well, that's what I would tell there were a number of classmates in business school who had been engineers, specifically software engineers, and they loved like the advanced modeling classes in finance. And I was always telling them, you need to go out for drinks with your classmates. Like the work we're doing in this first year class is more than you will do at Goldman Sachs. I spent a summer as an investment banking analyst too. But
oh, really? It's really interesting. If we ever meet in real life, we can have some beers over that kind of thing. It's an intense experience.
Yeah. So basically, I love engineers, and I did say that because I do see that like posturing sometimes, but I think on the spectrum it's less so than other industries. And that's one of the things I like about coding is at the end of the day, it's like you can prove it, show it, or not. And generally, now that I have more experience, if someone comes across as super braggy to me, I know, in the Django world, I know all the top people. Not a single one of them is braggy. They are modest to an incredible fault. So if I see someone who, as an engineer who's bragging, that's an immediate red flag for me, and I think most other engineers. Whereas it's sort of a prerequisite sometimes in other fields, but in engineering, that's like the best people don't think they're the best. So I'm not sure where you're getting that idea about yourself.
And so you then decided at a certain point that you wanted to make a go of a career teaching people and writing books about things like Django. And what was your first step? Was it writing a book?
So the first step was I taught at Williams College. I taught a web development course, actually with Meteor.js, which is a JavaScript framework, and I love doing that. But as all adjuncts will know, you're paid nothing. You're paid nothing, and it's a lot of work. So it doesn't really work, in a professional setting. But I've always loved teaching. I mentored and tutored throughout school, and actually after graduating for a summer, I taught middle school. So I've always had that in me, and you kind of have to because there's no economic reason to teach. It doesn't make any sense. But I started putting my stuff online on websites. So I had the djangoforbeginners.com site, and really I got sort of community proofreading because people would spot things and I had comments, and it was a while before I turned that into a book. And and then when I thought about, make it a book, I forget how I came across LeanPub, but I was used to the traditional way of using InDesign and realized like, oh God, like it's a lot of work to do this. And then when I saw LeanPub, I think is one of the authors. I think it was, an author I respected. I asked him, and he said he used LeanPub, and then and that's how I came across your service. And then it was just like, wow, like this is a total no-brainer. Makes everything so much easier. And there are some Open Libre. There's some open source options, but I found them. You guys provide a lot more value. So yeah.
And you, as I understand it, just now we'll transition to the last part of the interview where we talk sort of in the weeds about the self-publishing and how to be
Sure.
a self-published author. As I understand it, so your approach is to use LeanPub to make the books and to update the books, but your primary sales channels are not the LeanPub bookstore.
Yes. Well, you can decide if you want to include this or not.
Yeah,
so that's cool.
Just to preface this, so of course we would like it if everybody sold all their books and placed all their attention on all their effort on getting attention to their LeanPub book landing page or their LeanPub profile page. But we welcome authors of all kinds who might even have no intention whatsoever of selling their books on our bookstore. That's why we have subscription plans and things like that, and we offer all kinds of features, and that's like output in PDF, output in EPUB, output in Mobi, output in print-ready PDF, so that you can use LeanPub, and we will love you very much if you never sell a book on our bookstore.
Yeah. Well, so again, this is editing thing. So basically, it was. I actually had a lot of emails with Peter, which I give him credit for. Actually, I think you too. Maybe now that I think of your name, so the royalty change. You guys had that big one-page thing, and the royalty rate changed from 95 to was it 90 or 80, and then you were like, okay, but we're going to grandfather it in, and then you're like, no, actually, we're just going to go across the board, and so that's when I switched to Gumroad predominantly because they pay more, they pay every week, and they give me the email addresses. And those are three things LeanPub at the time didn't. So I'm not here to slag on you guys. I can say that, or I can sort of gloss around that.
No, that's perfect. I'm glad to have a frank discussion about it. So the way it worked was LeanPub from its inception paid 90% minus 50 cents per transaction. Yeah, and then we decided at one point that we wanted to for the sake of sustaining LeanPub in the long term, 80% was a better model than 90% minus 50 cents. And we were very trepidatious when we did this. And what we did was we grandfathered in the old books. So if you already had published a book and you were already earning 90% minus 50 cents, we left you with that royalty structure. But then we decided, no, we want just all books to be 80%. And we knew some people would decide that plus other things, like say, for example, in the case of Gumroad, weekly payments, and just to get into the business details of things like that. So for example, one of the reasons we don't do weekly payments is because we have a 45-day refund period, which is a very important part of how we position ourselves and how we brand ourselves. It's that you can buy a LeanPub book, and if you don't like it, you can return it with a couple of clicks. We give you 45 days to do that, and the reason for that is that LeanPub is focused on optimizing the self-publishing process for in-progress published books. So if someone write, we can't, it just wouldn't fit our business model to have a refund window that was much shorter than 45 days, because then we're saying to authors, in order to prove to people that you're still working on your book, you have to sort of publish a new chapter every month or something like that. And so that's one of the reasons for the 45 days. And the emails thing, so when someone buys a LeanPub book or they sign up to be informed about when one is published, they actually do have the opportunity to share their email address with the author.
Yeah.
But we don't make it mandatory. And believe me, we've had discussions with people who are much less friendly about it than you are.
Oh, I felt like I wasn't that friendly. I feel bad, but I gave it to you straight.
No, no,
Yeah,
no.
no, I understand. Yeah, it's emails are a hard thing um, on both ends for stuff. Well, I mean, I'll say one thing you guys do, which I really like, is the ability to pay more, because that's something I had heard from other authors, and it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. And actually, as a feedback for you, for y'all, I would love to be able to send a personal thanks to someone who does that. I don't have any way of, it's anonymous to me. So if someone, I've had some people who spent $100 on my book. I would love to send them a thanks, but I have no way of doing that.
Yeah. Just for everyone listening, another thing that we do that isn't very common is we have a variable pricing model, which means the author sets a minimum price for their book and a suggested price for their book. And so when someone goes to a LeanPub book landing page, it's set, there's this pricing slider that's set at the suggested price, and you can move it to the left all the way down to the minimum price, or you can move it to the right and you can pay more than you have to for the book. And this actually does happen. It's something that I think a lot of sort of like industry stalwarts find quite, or even just normal cynical people kind of find surprising. But another giving the author an opportunity to send a thank you message in that case is a really good feature suggestion. I don't think we've had that before. But one thing we have had before that's related to this, and many people have asked for it over the years, and we do intend to do it someday, is basically a tip jar. Because often what someone does is they might buy a book, even the minimum price might be free, and then they read it and they're like, oh, I really wish, like I want to, or they paid $5 for it and they're like, oh, you know what, this is actually worth $20 to me. What can I do? And currently our sort of hack is to buy a new copy of the book and then just archive one of the 2 copies in your library, which is what we recommend.
Oh, interesting.
Do. But one thing, like now that you've mentioned this, when we do implement the tip jar, we'll definitely think about how we can facilitate a thank you from the author for that, because like especially if someone's like directly going out of their way to come back and pay again, that would be a very good. That's a very good idea. Thanks for that suggestion.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think, my case is specific. So, one of the things that LeanPub does do is it provides a platform. So beyond the book creation, for which I think, I use and is by far the best, there is the discovery aspect. So I still have sales on LeanPub from people just coming to LeanPub. Meaningful sales. And there's the off the shelf feature for advertising, which I did. I got the yearly thing, and that's been helpful. In my case, because I'm focusing currently on this full time, and I have personal sites and I have a lot of SEO. I have 7-figure annual traffic to my personal site, so that's not common. So for that reason, as a content creator, I often ask people, like, how did you find my work, right? If someone's on do they go directly to Amazon and stay within that world, or then my site, and then they go, they read a blog post and they go to LeanPub, or they go somewhere else, they go to Amazon. As a creator, I would love to know, because that would be helpful. And this is another thing that just the book paradigm, I increasingly wonder if it's the best format for certainly framework books versus, a website where people log in and you can track better. But then that's a whole ton of work. And, for me as a content creator, I want to create content, not do all this other stuff. But that's one point I wanted to make, is that I think the reason why people don't create technical content is you need 3 things to do it. You need to know how to code, you need to know how to teach, and then you need to know how to market. And almost nobody has all 3. They certainly don't have the third one. And if they have the first 2, generally they can do consulting or other things that pays way better and is more fun. So, I'm sure for you guys as well, like you pump out a great feature. It's sometimes it's hard to understand that how important marketing is, but the more you do any business, you go, oh yeah, like marketing. Like for me, like I would love to write 10 more books. I could write 10 more planned, but I should be spending my time promoting the 3 that I have.
Thank you very much for saying that's really excellent advice and a really excellent way of putting it. When there's different types of work that you have to do, and marketing is not being lazy or whatever. Like this is just another phase of the project and a bigger part of whatever it is that you're up to. And often you do as people who want to create stuff and want to learn stuff and want to teach stuff, find it hard to sort of put all those tools down and just go do the marketing. But
it doesn't feel good, and you can't track it easily.
Yeah. But you do need to sort of understand that there will be periods of time in your campaign, let's call it,
Yeah.
when you're doing very little of the learning and the teaching and the writing, and you're doing a lot of the promoting. And you, on that note, so I know that you have also experimented with selling on Amazon as well.
Yes, it's a very meaningful sales channel for me, and I use the create PDF feature that you guys have.
Right, for selling print books on Amazon.
For selling print books. Yeah. I mean, and because Amazon has made a lot of changes recently. And actually I've emailed with your team that's been receptive to, they've switched over from, now they're doing KDP. They're doing their own self-publishing thing. So the format sizes have changed. It used to be that you couldn't do 7:9, which was the technical standard book size. It was only 8.5 by 11. But yeah, so I can create the files, and because everything on Amazon is print on demand, my books are always up to date, which is fantastic. And yeah.
And do you also sell ebooks through the Amazon?
I do now. I sell Kindle there. The hard thing about that is, so the royalty rate really matters, and this is something that doesn't matter to readers, but as a creator, it's really a kick in the nuts, because it basically, a print book is 60% minus printing costs. So that works out to about 50%. So a $40 book, you get $20. For a Kindle book, under $9.99, you get 70%, minus the transmission fee, which is totally bogus. So if you have any images in your book, as I do, that's another like $1 they're going to subtract out of it.
What?
Yeah, they charge a transmission fee for the network. So for example, if I charged $9.99 for my book, it wouldn't be that I get $7. It's more like $5.50 because I have images in it. Now, anything over $9.99, they switch to 35%. So on a $40 book, 35%. So, that's, what is that, like $14. So I make $20 on a paperback book that is print on demand, shipped, and no returns. Whereas a Kindle book, which has returns, and actually there's quite a lot of them, I make $14 on. So, so going forward, do I want to do Kindle? I kind of don't. But for now, I'm just putting it out there. But, it's, and you can, another thing too, unlike LeanPub, I've emailed with Amazon. It is possible to do updates, but it is incredibly tricky and not designed to do updates. So if you have a book that stays up to date like mine, again, so I sort of try to tell people, I recommend they go like LeanPub or another ebook route where they will get the updates than to go through Kindle itself.
Yeah, well, there's a number of, I did not know about that transmission fee. That's incredible.
It's lovely.
But so Amazon, for those listening who might not know, Amazon discourages sales of ebooks for more than $9.99, and they do this by charging you by paying you a lower royalty rate when you cross that threshold. And
yeah, so a $20 book makes the same as a $10 book.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of I mean, and you would know a lot more about this than me, but like there is a deep fight in there about the concepts of what the value of a book is. Mm-hmm. We could talk about this for a long time, but like, so someone would ask, so why would someone price an ebook at $15 when they could make it more for $9.99, when they would actually make more money if they sold it for
this is another good point.
And the reason is that the big publishing companies didn't want people to think of books as being worth $9.99. They wanted to think of them as being worth $15.99 or whatever. And so a lot of publishing companies would actually set a higher price, so dinging the customer more than they would otherwise, and get less themselves from that sale, because they were trying to do some high level positioning around what people's sense of what a book should cost would be.
Right. Well, and if you publish on Amazon, as I do, you are not allowed to offer it for less anywhere else, or they have the right to yank your book. Yeah. So, for example, so I'm not allowed. If they find it, they will, and they're pretty good at finding it. So my book is the same price. So that's partly why, it limits your pricing. On the other hand, I mean, it's easy to demonize Amazon, and I've done plenty of it. If you think about it as a self-published author, it is astounding that I can send a file in 7 countries currently. It will print on demand, handle everything for me, and just give me a check, and then 13 countries for Kindle. And that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But it is, there is this tension in the format of all books, and then especially technology books with updates and all these other things.
This is actually what I was just going to say, was that one of the, I mean, Amazon, just to be clear, like, is an amazing company in a lot of different ways. And like, LeanPub probably wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Kindle, for example. But like the device, I mean, and the normalization of the reading of ebooks and things like that. But this $9.99 pricing thing comes out of the non-technical book world.
Yes, like the romance fiction world.
And the non-educational book world. So with a technical book, one of the reasons technical books, and like technically we need programming and things like that, one of the reasons they can fetch a higher price than other books can is because the person who reads it makes more money after they read it. And so, for example, or saves time, which people, professionals often equate with money, right? So if I can say to you, hey, buy my book for $40, they're like, $40 sounds like a lot for a book. You're like, you can now bill yourself out as a higher level as a consultant, or now you can get work done in an hour that would have taken you 2 before. Most professionals will be like, I'd give you $400 for that.
Right. It's if I save you 5 hours, what is your billing rate? Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, as a teacher, basically you're selling to intermediate developers or professional developers who are in a time crunch, because beginners won't pay for anything because they don't know anything and they don't value stuff. So, they're kind of out. You can use them for SEO. I mean, I write tons of stuff for beginners. I actually prefer total beginners, but they're very hard to monetize. Experts are very much like read the manual types. It's someone who's an intermediate leveling up developer or who's new to the technology or framework, or it's someone who, and I think there's more of them who knows what their time is worth and will say, okay, I trust this author. And, for me, I buy books and resources all the time because I value my time, and this stuff is hard. So, but you can't help people who don't want to be helped. That's sort of the hard thing as a content creator. It's not really useful to bemoan the state of who will purchase content.
Speaking of wanting to be helped, that leads me to the last question that I always like to ask people on this podcast. So, bracketing our royalty rate and how often we pay people, and making people give their email address up in order to get a product. If there was one thing bracketing those 3 things, if there was one thing we could change for you, like say build for you, or one thing we could fix for you, what would you ask us to do?
That is a really good question. So I'm tempted to say one of 2 things. So one is around the market side of LeanPub. So the promoting books, if there's a way to, I can other than the shelf, more targeted advertising or marketing where, maybe someone bought a Python book or maybe someone bought another Django book. Is there a way that they, on the LeanPub site or through some other mechanism, can be told, hey, maybe you like that book, maybe you'd like something else? That would be something that would probably help sales in general, and certainly as an author would have value to me that I would pay for. On the creation side, so my books using LeanPub, I've only once had a complaint on the layout of my books, but it would. And I don't know the answer to this, but sometimes because of text and especially images, there are gaps on the print books, and I don't know what the answer to that is. Maybe if there was some custom way I could go in and fixed, an image or spacing here. But sometimes in some of my books there is spacing issues where largely it's like, oh, there's 3 paragraphs left, but an image is 6 paragraphs long, so it just bumps down. And that wouldn't happen on a professionally designed book, but the professionally designed book couldn't be updated all the time. So it's a tension I'm willing to take. And I don't know if there's a way to spot or give an option to clean that up, but that would be something nice.
Thanks very much for both of those suggestions. The first one is something that we're working on. And the second thing is, if you come across that issue in one of your books, if you could send us I guess if it's a print book, you might have to send us like a picture of it or something like that. But if you well,
it's in the PDF, right? It's in the print ready PDF.
Print ready PDF. Okay, if you could,
well, it would be, right? Of course it is, because it's just.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. If you could point us to an example of that, then obviously we have the underlying manuscript as well. So we can then look, I can talk to my colleague Scott about it, who's the expert on this kind of thing. So if you could just
Okay.
flick us an email or something like that, pointing us in the right place, we'll definitely look at that, because that's the kind of thing we like to keep on top of. And
Okay.
the more detailed the example, the better. So
Sure. Well, and I know from experience, I've had other things that I've emailed your team about, and I've always gotten, actually, I recognize Scott's name as well as yours and Peter's. So to the listeners, they really do listen. It's sort of like when I wrote sort of the slightly angry letter back in the day, the reason why I'm still using you guys is because you engaged with me and responded. And I know from working at startups that when someone is unhappy and takes the time to write you, they will then be, if you acknowledge them and answer their questions, they will then become your fiercest advocates, because they're basically writing the letter says, I want you to make this better, not I've given up. So you must have that as well, right? Like when you're dealing with customers, it's always like when they're really angry, I always try to think this is a really good thing because there's something I can do to make them happy. And if they want to be convinced to stay.
What I would say is, first of all, we don't enjoy getting angry letters. But I actually didn't remember that you. I mean, I don't think
I can send it to you after this. I don't know if it matters, but I remember it.
That's okay. But we do like passionate. We do like it when people are passionate, and one particular thing about being, to circle back, like to being in the book business, a book is something that someone spends a lot of time on. And it's very important to them usually for a lot of different ways. Like it might be, this is how I'm going to get ahead in my career. It might be, this is going to be my platform for getting to give conference talks. It might be, this is just something I really care about. And so we maybe face a little bit more passion than people do in other businesses, or at least kind of passion, because someone's like, I've spent 200 hours on this and I told my grandma about it, and now it came out and it looks bad, or it's broken, or something like that, or I'm on a deadline and things like that. And so we welcome feedback. We welcome impassioned feedback. And if we do something that makes you mad, we do want to hear that. And when someone takes the time to, if it's just a fuck you, then like that's not useful.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. It's concrete.
If it's a detailed argument, and particular, maybe one of the reasons when you brought that up, it didn't have any kind of emotional residue for me, was because like when we make big changes like that, we know there's going to be a reaction, and we know, and like if someone comes back at us at length with like and they're smart and they know what they're doing, that's really important to us, because one thing I'm not saying we're going to reverse any of these decisions, but like one thing we're always open to is what the future is going to look like, and getting feedback, whether it's happy or not, is really important to us. So, that's good.
Well, it's a strength of a company. I mean, because it, you always want to know what people think. And again, at least for me, when I do give feedback, I find that almost every tech company, even if it's the top person, I will get a response, and usually a pretty good one if it's some sort of detailed. It's not just a rage thing. It's this. I think this is off in some way, and this is why, because it's, so it's a kudos to you guys that listen.
Well, thanks for sticking with us, and thanks for taking the time to do this interview. I really appreciate it, and thanks for continuing to be a Lean Pub author.
Yeah, thanks so much. I don't get to talk about publishing with anyone anymore, so this brings me back to my old days. So it's fun.
Thanks. And thanks, as always, to all of you for listening to the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review the podcast wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Lean Pub author, please visit our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.